Welcome to Everyday Tarot, your daily dive into the divine wisdom of the tarot. I'm your host, Camille A. Saunders, and today I'll be talking about the Death card. Whether you're a seasoned tarot reader or just starting to explore, this podcast offers daily insights, intuitive messages, and practical advice drawn from the cards. Each episode is designed to help you connect with your inner wisdom, find clarity in your decisions, and tap into the energy of the universe. Tune in every day, Monday through Friday, for fresh perspectives and empowering guidance from the tarot as interpreted by me. The best way to support the podcast right now is to listen daily, rate, review, and to follow or subscribe in your chosen podcast app. The next best way is to check out my Patreon. Supporting me there gives you early access to upcoming podcast episode topics, digital downloads I've created, and monthly tarot hangouts with me and other listeners. The link will be in the show notes to check that out, and you can always go to my website, CamilleASaunders.com/everydaytarot, for all the latest information related to the podcast and to find images of the cards that I pull. If you're local to the greater Puget Sound area in Washington State, I'd love to see you at one of my Let's Talk Tarot meetup groups. I have events where we all bring some of our favorite decks and play around with tarot and oracle decks together. Maybe you'll even find a deck that you really like and can search for that one in particular in the future. Our next meetup is on Monday, February 10th at 6 p.m. at Katie Downs in Tacoma. And more information about that you can find in the link in the show notes for how to RSVP. All right, so into our main discussion for today. So welcome to season 3 of the podcast. In the first season, I introduced tarot through talking about oracle versus tarot cards, myths of tarot, how to find a deck, reading for yourself versus others, and more. In season 2, I went through the first 13 cards of the Major Arcana, one per episode. And today we're entering season 3, where I will go through the final 9 cards in the Major Arcana and then talk about each suit. So today, like I said, I'll be talking about the first card of the season, the Death card. So the Death card, the number associated with it in the tarot is 13. So numerology for 13s are good fortune, new beginnings, the ability to shape the future. Some traits associated with the number 13 are practicality, building foundations, safety, security, solidity, traditional, organized, and hardworking. And obviously there are like cultures or myths around the number 13 that might have you thinking differently about the number. Sometimes it's considered bad luck, and that kind of thing. But as we look at the number itself in a lot of ways, like it is very similar to the Death card, which is it's about new beginnings. It's about transformation, and it can even be about good things coming in the future. So common depictions of the Death card are like a Grim Reaper looking. Sometimes there's like a skeleton. Often there's a scythe, which is that long bladed thing that the Grim Reaper carries. And a scythe is generally used for farming to harvest like wheat or other crops, like by swinging it around. Again, this is sort of, you can still use them now, but like before heavy machinery, you would use this to cut down a lot of things at once. Again, for sort of harvesting. And then sometimes what's depicted is like transformation of some kind. So I've seen some cards that have like butterflies on them, or like I said, there's like the scythe or like this harvest idea. And we'll get into how some of the decks that I have depict them as well. So in the Anima Mundi deck, the Death card, it shows like a snake, and it shows like half of the snake looks like a normal snake, and then the other half shows the like shedded skin of a snake. So there's that like transformation sort of energy, or right, like things are changing. There's also white roses on the bottom of this card. In the Goddess of Love tarot deck, the card, I believe this depicts Kali, the goddess Kali, but there's a lot of like strong imagery in the card. So there's like a person or a goddess that has their head cut off, and it's like spurting blood. They're wearing like many necklaces, one of which looks like it has human skulls on it. And then they're sort of standing on this mountain of skulls. They have a sword, um, almost like a katana. I'm not quite sure, but it's like a curved sword, so it could be sort of harkening back to that image of the scythe, like the Grim Reaper has. And then there's roses at the top, the four of them, and they all have like almost like teardrops of blood like falling from them, or like raindrops if they were like the clouds of the image. And then the like beheaded head is being held in one hand. There's a sword in the other. And then behind the head is sort of like what looks like the sun, almost as if it's like an aura around the head itself. So again, strong imagery for the card. And then in the Sacerabita Tarot deck by Stasia Burrington, I would say this is maybe a more classical depiction. It looks like a person laying down. I'm gonna like imagine that they're dead, mostly because they look very gray and pale and stationary, almost like the position you would put someone in, like in a coffin. And then there's sort of this like this moment of transition, it looks like, where there's like a skull next to them, almost like, again, they're sort of transitioning into death. And then there's some kind of vine or like thorny plant that is climbing the wall. It sort of looks like behind them, that has like very dark colored leaves. Um, so yeah, that's sort of when I look at these, that's what I see on these cards, and talked about common depictions. So let's get into the meanings now, and I've alluded to some of this, but in the Taushen book, the Library of Esoterica tarot book by them, it talks about with endings come new beginnings. It brings transformation, radical elimination, and rebirth. There's this like meanings around like purging or like purification through destruction, which is probably kind of what this Kali, goddess Kali image of the goddess of love tarot deck is depicting. It's my guess. I just sort of think it's Kali based off of the colors and the look of it, but I'll pull up that deck and see what the goddess, what type of goddess it is. But yeah, so let me pull that one up first, since that one's kind of coming to mind right now. And again, this is the Goddess of Love tarot deck by Gabriella Herstick and Julia Popesco. All right. So death. And also, if you think about it, right, like part of why I'm moving to this new season is we finished the first like 13 cards of the Major Arcana, which was the numbers 0 through 12. And now this card is almost like a transition card, even in the Major Arcana, that we're transitioning into a new season where I'm going to have 9 more cards. So it's not exactly the middle, but it's close. And then the last 4 episodes of the season will be one for each suit. So, all right, yes. So the goddess depicted on the Goddess of Love tarot deck image is Kali, or China Masta. It says, and I talked about this in my pop culture of tarot episode, that the death card is one of the most feared in the 22 major arcana cards, and in a culture that suppresses rituals of grief and release, this makes sense. So again, often when you see this card in pop culture and movies and TV, or when people talk about it, that maybe don't practice tarot in their normal day-to-day lives, there's a lot of fear around this card of like, oh, if I pull this card, it literally means I'm going to die, or it literally means like death. But really, like the meaning of it is a lot more of like it's a turning point, it's a transition, something's transforming. Yeah, maybe something is being destroyed in the process, but there's also like this new thing coming. So Gabrielle Herstick talks about that death points to another paradigm where endings are not dreaded but seen as portals. Death and rebirth happen not as two instances on opposite ends of a linear cycle, but constantly at once, like the Ouroboros. And the Ouroboros is that image that you sometimes see that it looks like a snake eating its own tail, that's like a circle. So again, it's not that, right, there's like a line where at the beginning is birth and at the end is death. The idea with this is that it's a circle and that like birth and death is like the same at the same point in the circle. So the mother goddess Kali embodies this energy, the Hindu goddess of death and destruction, the void, rebirth, creation, transformation, and ego death, sings of non corporeal existence, of releasing the bonds you have to the material world in the ultimate act of surrender. Interesting as well, since yesterday, our last episode, we talked about the hanged man or the hanged one, which is all about surrender as well. So it says, only by embracing the inescapability of death can life become full of possibility, right? If we're always fearing the ending of things, that's really all what we're going to focus on, but often endings, right, help us move into beginnings of new things. In her emanation as Chinnamasta, one of the 10 Mahavidas, or wisdom goddesses of Tantric Hindu tradition, Kali becomes the goddess of ego death and guardian of Kundalini, the sexual energy that, when roused, leads to new states of consciousness. So again, talking about more like ego death, so death of, right, like maybe an identity that you held, maybe one that wasn't serving you anymore, and then like sort of moving into this new place, or even just like death of the illusion of control, right? That can also be what surrender is about. So death, the card, is an omen of change. It's rarely a literal death, and instead it's an ending that makes way for a beginning. Death can feel like a breath of fresh air, the promise of something new on the horizon. Death also means total surrender. Release your resistance to endings and recognize the power in the both at once, death and rebirth. Evolution sometimes comes from a sacrifice so deep that you have no choice but to yell into the abyss and give everything to the goddess without any expectations in return. So the journal question related to this card in the deck is, what is coming to an end and what is asking to be rebirthed from this place? And I didn't say it earlier, but usually in this deck there's an astrological correspondence for each card, and the one listed for this one is Scorpio. And Scorpio, as the zodiac sign, is also often about sometimes mystery, sometimes it's a water sign, so there's this sort of like emotional, like change, transformation. If you think about a literal scorpion and how they, right, can sting you, right, like that's also a kind of transformation. Again, maybe not always a pleasant one, but might force you into a new way to embody yourself, might force you into a new experience. And again, it's not right. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, right? Which I think is also where some of the like more valid fear around the card comes, is that like, right, again, as humans, we are great at adapting and also we hate it pretty universally. We dislike change, especially when it feels like we're forced into it. So again, sometimes that death card can feel like, why am I being forced to change, right? Why am I being forced to let this thing go? Maybe it's like moving, maybe it's like a job ending, maybe it's other things like that. Maybe again, it's like a literal life or something in your life that you're really clinging to that feels like, why is this like going this way? Why is this ending? And this card really asks us of like, okay, like, yes, we can grieve the ending, right? It's not saying that we should not have those emotions, but it's also saying like, by allowing our own grief and endings, right, and allowing ourselves to actually process that, maybe new things will come from that. And again, not to say that it's easy, but I think that that is kind of what this card is about. So if we look at one of my other decks that I have, the Anima Mundi deck. Like I said, that one depicts this death card as the Death Adder. So like a snake. It says the death card does not necessarily indicate physical death, but rather a card of change and transformation, like we've been talking about. Things must come to an end, but after that, new things can begin. Like a snake shedding its skin, death is about letting go of the old and embracing the new. And again, if you think about a snake, like this is a normal process for them, often is to literally shed their old skin and grow a new one, right? Like, and again, like that might not be like the most comfortable process for a snake. I don't know. Um, but right, like you get to, if you ever find like the shedded skin of a snake, it's quite striking because it's literally like the whole snake kind of depicted in this way, right? In this like former body basically that they had, or the skin of them, and then they grow new skin underneath that again is part of like how they stay healthy and clean, and it's just part of like their natural process. And like death is also part of, right, of life, of our process as humans, like whether we like it or not. Again, as Gabriella Herstick talked about in the Goddess of Love tarot deck, like there's a lot of there's not a lot of welcoming of death or like grief rituals in our culture. We have often like the literal burial process. We have maybe a memorial service or other things, at least in kind of like white Western culture. Sometimes there's religious rituals. But then, sort of, when that's over, um, there's often not a lot else that's like allowed, right? Emotionally. Sometimes you might get time off work, sometimes not, whether they have bereavement leave in your workplace and that kind of thing. So often there is this, like, and under capitalism, there is this pressure to just like move on, like get over it, like come back to work, get back to your normal life, and to not sort of accept or relish or be able to actually process and sit with the thing that ended, which again could be like a literal ending of something, but also can just be about like things transforming, things looking different than they used to before. And again, I think often when depicted in tarot, it can be like something that maybe they've been trying to like move on from, like trauma or get over, or just like process that maybe it's been like holding on for a long time, like months, years, decades, that, right, that maybe sort of finally gone through this process that feels like, okay, it's finally like I can let that go. And then, like, let's see what's on the other side. All right, I'm going to pull up the deck book description for the Sacerdote Tarot deck as well to see if there's anything else in there to add to this discussion on the death card. Pulling it up real quick. All right, so yeah, it talks about letting go, major transformation, new beginnings, an opportunity for huge growth and transcendence. Loss, sadness, and grief are present, and goodbyes and letting go may be necessary. The ending here may signify the end of a relationship, an interest, an old way of thinking, but also there's huge potential here for increased self-awareness, and the clearing out of the old is necessary in making space for the new, which I think is really what the Anima Mundi deck depicts with the snake, right? Like, you can't, like, the snake has to shed its old skin in order for the new one underneath to be able to, like, show up and fully be there. All right, and then there's quotes often in this book. So there's two quotes for this card. So a Rumi quote says, "Be like a tree and let the dead leaves drop." Which again, is someone that like gardens and spends a lot of time outside, like especially now that we're in winter in the northern hemisphere, right? Like trees benefit from their leaves being left on the ground all winter because it provides nutrients to the tree when it's in its sort of hibernation time, often in winter. And so when you remove the leaves or you tidy up your yard in that way, you're sort of taking away the natural nutrients that the tree has built up for itself, um, as its way to slowly allow itself to sort of um, bolster itself underground and then to be able to fully sprout and flower and come anew come springtime. So yeah, leave the leaves. It's important. So the other quote associated with this card in the Sasser Vita Tarot deck says, "I know this transformation is painful, but you're not falling apart. You're just falling into something different with a new capacity to be beautiful," by William C. Hannon. So again, sort of that encouragement that like it's not that this is an easy process. It's not that you should just get over it and not think about it or not worry about it, but to also just recognize that through the process of grieving and transition, that also makes room for new things. So in the Fearless Tarot book by Elliot Adam, How to Give a Positive Reading in Any Situation, they say that the Death card is about accepting inevitable change. Again, they talk about that it's the tarot's most notorious symbol for change and transformation. Many people are afraid to sit at a tarot reader's table because the dreaded death card might come up. We've all seen the movies in which the dark and mysterious fortune teller turns over the death card to foretell someone's ghastly end. In actuality, the death card is an invaluable card to get in a reading. It indicates that you are undergoing vitally important changes for your own good. Although not always welcome and sometimes shocking to experience, the changes before you are the next step in your personal evolution. Again, if you think about the Ouroboros, so it's that snake eating its own tail, right? Like when you get to like the head and tail portion, right? That just means that, okay, like there's new things coming along, right? It's not this linear process where you get to the end and that is like the end of everything. But that it is this sort of circular process, or at least I certainly believe it to be. Although death outwardly appears frightening, he is always accompanied by rebirth. Like the legendary phoenix, you too will rise from the ashes to live a joyful new life, revitalized and renewed. So again, like we as humans, right, we don't necessarily like change, especially when it feels like you don't have control over it, right, which is often, I think, how it goes. Situations happen or that kind of thing. But when we're able to look at it, sort of zoom out and look at it from this lens of like, okay, like this thing is ending and I'm going to grieve it. And then what is that going to make room for, right? What is that going to allow into my life? All right, so let's dive in and see what the cards have to say today on this topic. And again, I'm going to be thinking about as I pull this card, like, what do we need to transform? What's something we need to let go? What things are ending? What new beginnings are we welcoming in? All right, so I pulled a card from the Therapist Who Tarot deck by Rebecca Bloom and Drea Bloom. And in this deck, there's no deck guidebook for the cards, but there's an image on one side with a word associated with the card, and then there's questions on the other side. So I pulled the Four of Cups, and it sort of depicts, again, sort of like a humanoid figure that has four cups. Almost reminds me of how like the chakras are depicted, but there's like four that are sort of like in their body at like chest, stomach, um, like groin, and then like lower level. And the word associated with this card is contemplation. I'm going to look at the questions on the back, which say, how would you describe your relationship with fear? What does your heart truly desire? And what sacrifices must you make? Oh, so again, this is like a transformation card, right? Like we're addressing, right, what are maybe the death of things that we fear? What are the things that you want? And then what are you sort of willing to do to get there, right? To get into that space of transformation. Maybe things have to end or die or let go of in your life in order to get the things that you really want. And again, this can be as simple as I'll go back to myself. If I'm wanting to move to a new property that's bigger, so I can do all these things and garden, have livestock, what are the things that maybe I have to like get rid of in my garage right now in order to clear space for me to like mentally and emotionally feel ready to move, right? Maybe that is that's kind of what's coming up as a personal example right now to me. All right, so again, those questions to think about are: how would you describe your relationship with fear? What does your heart truly desire? And what sacrifice must you make? Okay, so links for the tarot decks that I've talked about will always be in the show notes and on my website if you'd like to look at them or purchase them. And thanks for joining me today on Everyday Tarot. Just as a reminder, the podcast will come out daily, Monday through Friday for all of 2025. All right, see you soon. Bye-bye.